Hello all. So this is part two of the history of the short story. I'm hoping this will be the last part. I hope I can get through the rest. If not, there may be a very short third part. I don't know right now because I'm recording this again, and everything is just kind of different whenever I do this. Um, all right. So this is the slide we left off on during the early Romantic period, this major period of evolution in the 1700s. It was at this point that horror and crime, the first beginnings of genre fiction, became popular. And it was also at this point when people began to have um, easy access to literature on paper. Okay. Now, it was at that time that the novel, as we know it today, also sort of was born. And that's a whole other fascinating story, but that's not what we're focusing on in this class. So that period in the 1700s, the early Romantic period, the novel is born, and it's what we know of it today. About 100 years later, in the early 1800s, we begin to see um, what will eventually sort of become the modern short story, the contemporary short story that we know of. This is sort of the period of the proto short story. Um, and this quote sums it up nicely. A different kind of short fictional narrative emerged, an original prose work in which every word chosen in the structure of the plot and every detail of description and characterization contributed to a unified impression. This goes back to that whole unity of effect, that idea that a short story is just like a photograph, not a movie. Very focused and deliberate decisions must be made. I mean, I'll argue, and a lot of writers will argue that that's true of all literature, of all fiction, but in the context of this course, it's crucially important in short fiction. So we're just going to focus on the short fiction aspect. But this effort to build a unified impression is very much what sort of that fork in the road that led us to the contemporary short story. We're going to talk about geographical, social influence and importance in a minute, but you should, you know what, we'll do it now. You've probably begun to see a pattern that once the short story grew out of the oral tradition, which was a worldwide phenomenon, we'll call it, and moved more into actually written texts, you see how this has evolved globally with influence from certain certain geographical, political, cultural areas. The Semitic alphabet, for example. The first written communication came out of Mesopotamia. From there, it spread throughout the Middle East. We got a huge influence from the Middle East at that point, and then this is all about sort of the meshing of ideas. And once this spread to Europe, we saw a lot of innovation in Europe, and that's still where we are at this point in history. But we'll see some more shifts here in a moment. But during this period, in the early 1800s, a lot of what contributed to the evolution of the short story came out of Germany, out of fiction in Germany, especially, and this makes me so excited, as I always tell my students this when I get to this point, but my family lineage, we are actually descended from Jacob Grimm. So we can trace back our family tree to him. So I get very nerdy when it comes to the Grimm brothers and how they contributed to language and fiction and just the way we view fiction as an art form, really. So the Grimm brothers, Wilhelm and Jacob, they were linguists by trade. They studied how language actually works, the function and sort of the mechanics of language and how it differs and evolves. within cultures and over time, all of that. Linguistics is a very fascinating field. They were also writers, and they were also scholars and curators. So a lot of the influence, a lot of what forced short fiction to change from this point came from them when they assembled their tales, which were inspired by folk material. They read sort of the cultural milieu, which was focused a lot on horror and crime, without sort of that moral lesson, but adding an aesthetic value. So this formation of short fiction, short literature as an art form, they read sort of that out there in the culture, and they assembled and curated folk material, oral tradition stories, and they assembled them in an artistic manner. And that's where we get the Grimm's fairy tales, which contributed directly to German Expressionism, and then how the short story evolved from here, especially with Romanticism in America and Britain. Okay? And this is also where Gothic fiction comes from, but we're going to get into that here in a moment. Okay? Oh, it's frozen. Sorry about that. My computer froze for a moment. All right, so we left off at German, the German influence. It was also at this point where the short story began evolving in the United States based off of what was happening in Germany. So at this time, in the early 1800s, early to first quarter of the 1800s, Washington Irving began to write short fiction, and he is credited with having the first successful American short story. And this is a quote regarding this. There is a constant activity of thought and a nicety of execution required in writings of this kind. In a novel, the mere interest of the story permits pages of careless writing. But in these, oh, it's cut off. But in these short writings, basically, I can't believe that happened. That's cut off. Anyway, basically, this is reinforcing the idea that in the short story, as it's evolving in America, is that every word must be precise. And it was at this time that Nathaniel Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe began writing wildly often, I should say. Also in America at this time, magazines began to come into popularity. So magazines at that time, rather than being the op-ed sort of focus that they are now, at that time magazines were mostly collections of short fiction and poetry. So Nathaniel Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe started writing at the time, and they their work was focused in the Romantic movement. This is at that time when literary movements, different periods of the evolution of literature became clearly defined. Prior to this time period, there was the early European Romantic period, and then before that was the centuries-long mess of medieval literature, and that's about it. So Romanticism, which we're going to talk about in, I believe it's the next video lecture after this, History of Short Story. Romanticism had a lot to do with nature, with sort of a more creative, beautiful narrative voice and language. There was a focus on nature and emotion, really, and sort of that almost like the animalism of humanity. Okay, and while they were writing, there was this the shift from Romanticism to realism began. And these are two little just like clickbait phrases that I think sum up Romanticism. So Romanticism is idealized by reverie. It's idealized by sort of the thought and meditation, contemplation, artistry, aesthetics of, it's an idealized version of all of those things relating to the human experience, with a strong focus on nature and emotion. Realism then was sort of a more down-to-earth, less poetic, less flowery focus on social masks in everyday everyday reality. We are shifting more from the fantastic and a focus on horror, fantasy, those sorts of things, to just everyday life. A lot the interest in people who were reading, their focus shifted, and those who and writers who are creating their shifted focus more from this idealized fantasy, which still may have been like dark and horrific, to just beat by beat human life and typical human experiences. Okay. All right. I'm gonna pause again here. Okay, we're back. So at this point, late 1800s, mid 1800s is where we start to see really sort of the conventions of the contemporary short story are solidified. We now know what ideally, we know what a short story is at this point. It's defined in a qualitative way, not remotely close to a quantitative way. And then by the 1800s, we're at this point now where American realism has shifted across the world. So now we begin to see a global shift towards realism. Romanticism is dead. We're no longer writing about, ghosts and monsters and stuff like that. We are now focusing just on the minutia in the drama of everyday life, the drama in sort of the mundane. Here's a quote about realist authors. They usually refrain from commenting at great length on their characters' psychology. Instead, their psychology is manifested in things said and done by characters themselves. While romantic writers are interested in subjective states of awareness per se, realist writers are likely to be concerned with social causes and consequences of those states. This actually says a lot. We're shifting now from the contemplative thoughts of our characters in these beautifully written, gothic, romantic, idealized, emotional states to subjective states of awareness, simple states of perceiving reality relating to social causes and consequences of just being alive at a certain time period. It's also at this point that we begin to see regional fiction develop. We're going to get into this a lot more later, but just within the United States, there are definitive differences between Northeastern literature and then literature of the South, or literature of the Midwest. Those are the three big ones. And within Russian literature, you see a lot of the same thing. So, again, focus on everyday experience. Here are some writers who are famous, realists. I'm not going to get into that at this time. We're going to keep going, and hopefully we can get through all of this. It's not happy right now again. I don't know why. I'm going to pause. All right, I'm actually going to stop this video lecture here because we only have like a little bit left to go, but it's pretty dense. So there's going to be a third part video. It'll just be a couple minutes long though. I'm almost out of time here anyway.